My name is David Pellow, and I used to be a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota, and now I'm working at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm in the Department of Environmental Studies here, and I'm also the chair of that department. And most of my teaching and research and service and activism really centers around this issue of environmental justice. So
Yeah.
it's really wonderful to meet you. So one project I'm working on is examining the relationship between prisons and jails and immigrant detention centers and juvenile detention centers in the United States and environmental threats. So it turns out that many of these carceral facilities are places where we find water contamination, where the quality of the air is often really poor, the ventilation is often malfunctioning or hasn't been cleaned in years. We also find that the food in many, if not most, prisons in the United States, and now I'm actually expanding this work globally. The food is just inadequate. The medical care, if it exists at all, tends to be inadequate, which probably doesn't surprise many folks because, most people think, oh, if you're in prison, you've been convicted of a crime, we're really not going to invest a lot in making sure that you're healthy and taken care of. But it turns out that some countries actually believe that that's not a good idea, that it actually makes sense to take care of people who have been incarcerated so that when they re-enter society, they won't be scarred and traumatized and they'll actually be able to contribute in a productive way. But yes, at prisons and jails all around the US and around the world, we are finding a host of environmental threats, public health threats. And this is an environmental issue, an environmental justice issue, because it involves environmental threats that are being faced by vulnerable and marginalized populations. These populations just happen to be prisoners. And what's exciting about this project isn't just that negative aspect that, oh my God, this is horribly oppressive. Look at what's happening with these people. That's true. They are definitely suffering. But what's so exciting is it turns out, and I had no idea that I was going to find this, is that many of these prisoners are not taking this situation passively. They are standing up for their rights. They're suing immigrant detention centers, prisons, jails, everywhere. They're writing letters, sometimes having to smuggle letters out to friends and lawyers and allies and family members and media to get the word out. And in some cases, they're actually successfully stopping environmental injustices. So there's an example in Pennsylvania where one prisoner organized about 800 of his fellow prisoners to write letters to the media and to the township supervisors to stop a coal gasification plant that was going to be built next door. So that was a massive victory for environmental justice, not only for the prisoners, but for the surrounding towns. And so for me, one of the most surprising findings of this study is that some of the most exciting and innovative leaders in the environmental justice movement are people who are caged, people who are behind bars, people who are legally enslaved in the United States and elsewhere, who are really leading this movement in really important ways. So that's one big project I'm working on. Probably leave it at that unless you want to know more. I've debated whether I should have used that term or not. It's also a term that other scholars have used as well, but I think it's generally attributed to a 2005 book that I co-edited with Robert Bruhl, where in the introduction to that book we use this term. And essentially it's like in any other field of scholarship where you're taking a look at some of the early works, the foundational ideas and debates and conclusions in a field, and you're asking, well, what's the next stage? What's the next step? How can we actually do better? How can we build on that important foundation and extend this work in new directions? And so this is where the word critical comes from. And so we try to do, in the book, what is critical environmental justice, really try to push the field forward in a number of ways, one of which is to say, hey, understanding that race and class inequalities matter a great deal in terms of where environmental threats are found in the United States and around the world. That is, low income or low wealth people and people of color and many ethnic minorities tend to live and work in conditions that are disproportionately threatened by environmental risks compared to the rest of us. That's super important, but one of the things that I say with the book is that we have to build on that and go beyond just race and class and ask, well, what about gender? How does being, living in a situation of patriarchy affect people's life chances with respect to environmental threats? How does disability, how does nationality, how does being indigenous, how does age, these sorts of things, ability or disability, how do these things intersect with environmental threats and opportunities? And how can those be resources in building a stronger, more diverse and more robust environmental justice movement? To return to the first question around the prison environmental justice project, well, again, little did I know, and I think little do most environmental activists know, that some of the strongest leaders in this movement and allies are people who are behind bars. And so I think that's a resource and an opportunity that we need to pay attention to. So critical environmental justice is really just like any other idea in any other academic field. The idea is, let's push this field in new and productive directions to deal with a changing terrain of environmental threats. Yeah, it's a really important question, and like most people with an inquisitive mind and a heart and a soul, I think we both are deeply concerned about this, as we are with a number of crises and pandemics, if you will. People have often, said over the last several months that COVID-19 is not the only pandemic. There's the pandemic of racism that is, as we see, is intersected with COVID-19, the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic or crisis of environmental racism, and of course, anthropogenic climate disruption, along with a host of other issues, wildfires, the economic collapse, etc. But yeah, I think, it's really important to keep in mind, first of all, that as has been reported by a number of scientists and journalists, that COVID-19 is what we call a zoonotic disease. This is a disease that can jump from one species to another. And this is a disease that many of us believe has been caused, certainly exacerbated, by the fact not just that a non-human animal may have infected humans and now humans are infecting other humans, but because humans have actually encroached on previously non-human habitat, right? And so the massive urbanization and suburbanization and industrialization that we see happening in many, many parts of the world has really contributed to this. And in my neck of the woods, in the state of California, you see this in terms of the wildfires, where people are saying for the first time ever, my God, these wildfires are coming into our communities. How is that possible? They're destroying entire neighborhoods and towns. And guess what? That's kind of right, but it's mostly wrong. If we really look at history and what's unfolded, the fires aren't necessarily coming into our communities. We've come into natural habitats that humans, for the most part, have not occupied, at least in large numbers like we do today. So COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease that's crossing the species boundary. And as you pointed out, it is exacerbated by and exacerbates environmental racism in a whole host of ways. Some examples include the fact that, and this has been reported by a number of scientists and medical journalists, that communities in the United States and around the world that have suffered from environmental injustice and environmental racism, that have been disproportionately affected primarily with air pollution in many central cities, are that much more vulnerable and susceptible to COVID-19, because COVID-19 is transmitted through aerosol, through the air, right? This is a disease that people can pick up through breathing. And if you are a person who's living in an area where, in some cases, the majority of people, or a high percentage of people, have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, other respiratory illnesses like asthma, those folks are more vulnerable. They have heightened susceptibility to COVID-19. So you see this layering of threats and risks. It's like, damn, I'm already facing environmental injustice because I'm, a person of color or an immigrant or an indigenous person or a low-income person who's being disproportionately affected by air pollution. Those communities are also disproportionately affected by COVID-19 for a whole host of reasons, one of which is this susceptibility. Another example of that has been reported in the media as well goes back to my prison environmental justice example. We find that some of the most severe hotspots of COVID-19 in the United States and around the world are in prisons. They're in prisons for a whole host of reasons. One is that, of course, physical distancing is virtually impossible in many prisons. The prisons are set up to have people packed in great density, high density in tight quarters. Prisons are also places, as I mentioned earlier, where medical care tends to be abysmal. And that's when it even exists. Prisons are also places, of course, where people oftentimes come into these facilities with pre-existing conditions that are often the result of environmental racism, often the result of just the pressures and anxieties and stresses, the biomedical stresses of living in a racist society. We are definitely seeing that in places like the United States, among other countries. Finally, I would say, on a maybe more positive note, we have this phenomenon, well, I won't use the word that some people have used, but this phenomenon of people who tend to be of a conservative bent, who don't believe that COVID-19 is real. And those are also people who are generally aligned with a political party that tends to be racist, that is also a political party that tends to promote the incarceration of people of color. So you have this oppressive system that really is intersecting in many ways to harm certain people and to elevate other people. And so, unfortunately, of course, these folks who don't believe that COVID-19 is real, well, they're finding out that it is real because they are also being affected by it. And so the last thing I'll say about that is that one thing that I hope really does die post-COVID-19 is this Western European cultural idea that each and every one of us is autonomous individuals who can just move through life and move through society and move through this world of our own accord, and we don't have to worry about or care about or even affect other beings. We know scientifically and culturally that's a myth, that's idiotic. All right, I'll use the word. These are COVIDiots. That's the phrase that people have used. And so I want that idea to die. And the idea that needs to be reborn has been around, of course, for thousands of years. And that is, there is actually, scientifically speaking, no such thing as an individual. The smallest unit of being on planet Earth in our ecosystems is actually at least two beings. And so this is why on my Zoom feed, you often see in my name, and I don't see it here. Oh, there it is. Yes, my pronouns, he and him, but then there's a they. That's actually not meant to be a gender pronoun. It's meant to be a reflection of the biological, ecological reality that I am not an I. I'm not a single individual. I am made up of literally millions of beings. And so it would be more proper to say David Pellow, we, because I am actually a plural being. I'm a symbiont. And so I really think we need to take that idea to heart so that people can invest in public health education much more and understand that what happens to one of us directly or indirectly affects us all. And COVID-19 is a very good example of that, as is environmental injustice. It doesn't just affect poor people, people of color, immigrants, indigenous folks. It affects us unevenly, but in the end of the day, everyone is negatively affected by that. And we all, therefore, have a stake in building stronger, more democratic, more resilient, and more just communities in which we see ourselves as connected, interconnected, interdependent, and frankly, family. We are all family. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but I get passionate about this. We're seeing many of those now, but of course, any scientist and any observer who's keenly paying attention to this will tell you, we really can't know what the outcomes are going to be. We don't know what the long-term public health and medical effects of COVID-19 will be on people's bodies and on the population. We can speculate. There will be many challenges ahead, no doubt. And of course, as I mentioned in answer to your previous question, we are already, of course, seeing intersections, negative intersections of COVID-19 with a variety of other indicators, social, economic, and environmental and health indicators in our society. What I do hope will be an outcome, a series of outcomes of this COVID-19 era. And then you said if and when we go post-COVID, I'm really hoping it'll be a win and very soon. Again, I hope that, I mentioned two things, that we will see a deep commitment to investing in public health education. Of course, there's one political party out there, the Republican Party, that it wants nothing to do with that, but that's at their own peril as well. As we see, people who are even conservative are being deeply affected by, and they're dying because of COVID-19. So really don't have a choice. Deep investment in public health education. So this idea of being a COVIDiot, somebody who doesn't believe in COVID-19, doesn't believe in climate change, doesn't believe in racism, doesn't believe in the interdependence of humans and non-human worlds, that we really confront that idea, those misperceptions and myths. So, and that has to happen in the schools, right? That has to happen in public institutions and private institutions, and I think that will. I also think, again, this idea of the autonomous, singular, non-interdependent individual has to die. We really have to see ourselves as interconnected. And that will have such positive impacts on our economy, our culture, our societies, and our ecosystems. And I also think that overall, I think what we see around the world in many hotspots where COVID-19 is just taking off, we tend to find that many of those societies tend to be autocratic and tend to be run by strong men who are often misogynist, that is, hating of women. They tend to be racist, and they tend to not really be deeply invested in democracy or environmental protection. And so whether it's Brazil, whether it's India, whether it's the United States, I could go on and on. Many, but not all, but many of these societies where we're seeing hotspots of COVID-19 are also places where we find that problem correlated with a whole host of other problems that tend to be associated with right-wing authoritarian racist governments. So my big hope is not only in the United States, but around the world, people will take seriously the idea that in societies where there is stronger democratization, where there is stronger commitment to rule and governance, not by a single political party, not by a single human being, but shared governance by all the people, that is actually a really, really good way structurally to strengthen a society's ability to deal with future threats like COVID-19, current threats like COVID-19, and current threats like climate change and racism. And so I think the evidence, the empirical evidence, is very, very clear and very, very strong that democracy and democratization are really, really good for public health, for lowering our stress, and for addressing environmental and social issues of our era. So those are some of my hopes. So I'm working with a group of students here at my institution, and in the next couple of weeks, we will have a new annual report from the Global Environmental Justice Project that really lays out a whole host of issues that connect, as I was talking about earlier, prisons and environmental justice issues. And in addition to talking about some of the heavier, more controversial and sensitive issues of oppression and risks and threats to people's lives and well-being, we also really, in this report, will be uplifting some of the positive stories about what people are doing to fight back and to declare and try to achieve justice inside and outside prisons. So that annual report will be out in a couple of weeks, and you can find that on the Global Environmental Justice Project website at UC Santa Barbara. So the other thing I would like to say is I just, I spent 7 years in Minnesota, living in the Twin Cities and working at the U. And they were some of the 7 of the best years of my life and career. So much of what I do as a scholar and as a teacher and as a mentor and as an activist, and so much of who I am as a person, as a human being, is the result of conversations I had and things I learned, and kindness and compassion that was shown to me by students, staff, and faculty at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and by just wonderful people in the state of Minnesota. So I really enjoyed my time living there, and I try to get back regularly. I was supposed to come back just a couple months ago in June, but of course, COVID-19. So I look forward to the next time I'm able to visit the good folks in the Twin Cities there. So that's, I think, all I have to say for now.